Morning, everyone. We're gonna get started in just a moment. Okay, just for some station identification for today, our Facebook Live broadcast is being done through a new from a Facebook page, a new location for us called webyeshiva.org, which is a Jerusalem-based online yeshiva program, which has a number of shiurim. They've requested that we go through their portal, so to be able to have a larger potential audience. And we are broadcasting now from the Bayit in Thornhill, Ontario, just for people online to be able to know where we are. This is the Moreh Nevukhim shir that we've been doing now for a little bit over a year. And we are now currently in the first section, chapter 19 of the Moreh Nevukhim. The text that we are using is the English translation of Moreh Nevukhim by Professor Shlomo Pines and it is published by the University of Chicago Press. The book is attainable on Amazon and in various other venues, but that's the translation that we are using. And every week we usually have some kind of handout to be able to add some additional components to the shir. Those handouts are posted usually every week on the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. And as well, all of these shiurim will be posted afterwards on webyeshiva.org, as well as my personal Facebook page, and as well on the page of the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. Okay, so I hope that's enough of station identification. Now that we've got that cleared up, let's, if anyone needs the actual text, here it is, a few copies, and now we'll give out the handout. I don't believe that this is up yet on the shir in Moreh Nevukhim, but we will post it right after the shir. I'm sorry for not having posted it earlier. There's actually, as you'll notice on the other side of the sheet today, we're going to be quoting from a later chapter of the Moreh Nevukhim, section 1, chapter 64, and you'll see why very shortly. Let us get our hemshech, let us get our continuity from the previous chapters. We're up to chapter 19 today. In the Moreh Nevukhim text, it's on page 45. In chapter 17, we saw that the Rambam engaged in a very short discussion of Chomer and Tzura, of matter and form, where he discussed the idea that the entire world, at least according to Aristotelian science, is comprised of a combination of matter and form, and that even though form infuses matter and gives it substance, gives it a sense of shape and all of its features, there is an ultimate form above all form, and that is God himself. God is the tzur of the tzura. And because of that, there is an immediate association that can be made in one's mind between God and the physical universe. And therefore, the Rambam in chapter 18, which we studied last week, was very careful to cite a number of verbs which when used in physical terms, of the earth, or supposing that this were possible in the highest part of the ninth heavenly sphere. For he is not farther off from God in one case or nearer to him in the other. For nearness to him consists in apprehending him. How is a person close to God? When a person has an intellectual experience of comprehending Hashem. And there are many gradations, and he said that there are many levels of prophecy, and this all has to do with, this is really the Rambam's entire approach, is to remove any sense of corporeality from Hashem, even when the Torah itself appears to be describing a corporeal feature of God. That's a misreading, and we'd have to reread that passage in order to be able to understand it properly. And this brings us up to chapter 19, which is now the next verb, to fill. to be malay. Mem lamed aleph is the shoresh that the Rambam is dealing with. It's a short chapter. This is an equivocal term applied by people speaking the Hebrew language. Now, it refers to the first way that we use this verb malay, mem lamed aleph, is a body's entering and filling up another body. Completely physical, completely a physical description. So, for example, and she filled her pitcher, right? Parshas Chaye Sarah, which we're going to be reading in a couple of weeks. Vatered ha'aina, vatimale chada vata'al. That Rivka goes to the well, and she fills up her jug, and she brings up the jug. So the word vatimale, to be malay, is filling a jug with water. How do you fill a jug with water? Limalot et ha'akad. Okay, that's the first example. Another example is an omer full for each, which is the next source from Exodus chapter 16, where God says, Milo ha'omer mimenu. Take a jug, take a container, and fill up an omer's worth of man, of the manna, with this, into this tzinsenet, into this jug or container, and it will be for you, lemishmeret lidorotechem, it will be for your remembrance. So the word milo, to fill up, literally means to fill, take a physical object and put it inside and to fill up, occupy the space of that other object. This usage is frequent. That's the first use of malay. Now we get to the second use of malay. The term is likewise applied to the coming to an end and completion of a measurable period of time. We're no longer talking about occupying three-dimensional space, but now we're getting into the fourth dimension of time. That time is also uses the verb malay to say that the time is completed, the time is filled. So for example, and her days were fulfilled. Va'yimla'u yameha laledet v'hinei tomim bivitna, which is also referring to Rivka when it's time for her to give birth. Right? The days of her pregnancy were complete. And again, that is va'yimla'u. So it's not a filling up spatially, but it's a filling up of time. So it's used chronologically. And 40 days were fulfilled for him. This is a reference to the death of Yaakov Avinu, where there were 40 days that were necessary for the embalmers in Egypt to prepare the body. And when those 40 days were completed, vayimla'u, then they transported the body to the land of Canaan. And now we get to the third use of the term malay. The term is also employed to signify the achievement of perfection in virtue and of the latter's ultimate end. Now, this word perfection, Rambam uses an Arabic word which means shleimut, which means completion or perfection in Hebrew. And we're going to see how this is the third term which the Rambam is going to be focusing on, which is that when the word malay is used in the context of Hashem, it's really referring to God in terms of completion in anything that is related to God. So let's see. So, thus, and full with the blessing of the Lord, which is a reference to Naphtali. Ula Naphtali Amar. Naphtali, when Moshe Rabbeinu gives the blessing to Naphtali in Deuteronomy chapter 33, it says, Naphtali seva ratzon umalei birkat Hashem, that he is satisfied of will and he is filled with the blessing of God. Yam vidarom Yerasha. His inheritance is the sea and the south. This is a special blessing given to Naphtali, the tribe of Naphtali. Now, in trying to explain what malay means, what means complete over here, clearly it is a reference to a sense of completeness having to do with being infused with a blessing from Hashem. So, the Ramban on this pasuk, if you take a look at the next source, the Ramban on that pasuk says, V'hanachon, the Ramban says that the correct meaning of this word malay means, Shehu nimshach el Hashem hanichbad, that the word malay is a reference to God's exalted name itself. Yomar seva umalei ratzon Hashem hanichbad uberachto. that we are saying that Naphtali is satisfied or sated and filled with God's desire that is glorified and which has blessed Naphtali. Aval b'medrash shel Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakaneh. So basically, Naphtali is filled with God's blessing, right? God desires Naphtali and fills him with blessing. But then he quotes from the Sefer HaBahir. Now, the Sefer HaBahir is a sefer which we'll probably come back to in a few places. The Rambam really rarely makes mention of it, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi makes more extensive mention of it in the Sefer Kuzari. It is a early medieval sefer written in the period of the Gaonim. It is attributed to Rabbi Nechunya ben Hakaneh as the author, who was one of the Tanoim, and it has mystical information about how the world was created. But for our purposes, let's take a look at a passage from the Bahir in chapter 7, section 9. It says as follows, Yashav Rabbi Amoroi v'Darash. Rabbi Amoroi expounded as follows, Mai dichtivu malei birkat Hashem yam v'darom yerasha. What is this? What do those words mean that when it says that Naphtali is filled with the blessing of God, his inheritance is the sea and the south? Kach amar Moshe. What Moshe was saying as follows, Im telech b'chukotav tirash ha'olam hazeh v'ha'olam haba. That if you walk in God's ways, you will inherit both this world and the next world. Yam v'darom are references to both this world and the next world. Why? Because ha'olam haba shuhu nimshal hayam. The world to come is compared to an ocean. Shene'amar urechava mini yam. As it says in the book of Job, in a reference to the world to come, this heavenly, this celestial existence is wider than the ocean is vast. V'ha'olam hazeh nimshal lidarom, and this world is compared to the south. Shene'amar ki eretz hanegev nitatani umitargaminan are ara deroma. Because in Sefer Yehoshua, it makes reference to the southern land, the Negev. And contextually, Chazal say that refers to this world, the world that we live in. And maybe the reason why it's called south is because south refers to being down below. I'm not sure if that's the reference or not. But the point is that this pasuk has a deeper understanding. That when it says that Naphtali is going to be filled with the blessing of Hashem, it means that a person can occupy God's blessing throughout existence. In other words, a person gets filled with Hashem's blessing all over. So the Ramban says that this is what is the deeper meaning of this pasuk. When Moshe was blessing Naphtali, it's really a message to all of mankind that if a person follows in the way of Hashem, he receives the complete fullness of Hashem's blessing in every possible realm of existence. And then he says, another example of being filled, them has he filled with wisdom of heart. And what is that a reference to? That's from Sefer Shemos, that milei otam chochmat lev, that God filled them, referring to Bitzalel and Oholiav, the architects and builders of the Mishkan, he filled them with a wisdom of the heart. So again, being filled is not spatial, it's not chronological, but it's being filled with a sense of perfection. He was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill. This is a reference to Hiram, who was the architect of King Solomon's temple. Hiram of Tyre, who was the architect. Everyone needs a good architect, so this was the architect that Shlomo HaMelech used. And he too was filled with a wisdom and understanding and skill. It says, Vayimalei et ha-chochma ve'et ha-tevuna ve'et ha-da'at. He was filled with wisdom and understanding and knowledge. La'asot kol melacha, to do all of the work that was required, especially with the copper work. Okay. And finally, he was filled with wisdom and understanding. Now we go on to, it is in this sense it says, Melo chol haaretz kivodo. In this sense, when we talk about the word malay as being a sense of completion, that's why the Torah says the whole earth is filled with his glory. It's not the Torah, it's Sefer Yeshaya, Isaiah. It says that when describing the celestial angels, the seraphim, and it talks about how they behave in the celestial realm. It says, V'kara ze el ze v'yamar. Each angel calls out to the other, granting each other permission to go first, which is, we learn derech eretz from the angels. And they say, Kadosh, 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 Hashem, holy, holy, holy is God. Milo chol haaretz kivodo, the whole world is filled with His glory. And as we know from Targum Yonatan, which we actually have as part of our prayers in the Uvalet Zion prayer that we say during Shacharit, Targum Yonatan says, once again, this idea of being filled is a reference to being filled in all realms of existence, both Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. As a matter of fact, the reason why the angels say holy, holy, holy 3 times, Targum Yonatan states as follows. Just skip down to where it says Targum Yonatan. It says, Umekablin dein min dein ve'amrin, Kadish bishmei meroma ila'a beit shechintei, that the angels get permission from each other to recite the words, and they say, Kadosh, first time God says, they say Kadosh, is bishmei meroma ila'a, in the higher celestial realm of God. Kadish al-ara, ovad givorte. The second time they say Kadosh is to represent the fact that God is holy down on this world, which He has created. And the third time they say Kadosh is Kadish le'olam ulolmei olmaya. They say that God is holy forever and ever. So the 3 Kadoshes are really covering the Rambam's 3 definitions of the word Malay. Just going in reverse order, right? Kadosh means the entire celestial realm is filled with God's glory. The second Kadosh is spatially filling the world with God. And the third Kadosh is the chronological filling, where God is completing all of time, where Kadosh is, right? God is throughout the ages, from the beginning of time until the end of time.
The Rav said Kadosh, 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 we learned Derech Eretz. What's the Derech Eretz?
The angels, umekablin, right, it says that v'kara ze el ze, they call out to each other. Please, you go ahead, recite. The other angel says, no, you recite. Nimrshut ze la ze. That's what we say in the tefillah.
These are Canadian angels, bro.
They're Canadian angels. No, they don't say sorry.
It means that we should recognize other people. That's the idea. What's the idea?
The idea is that we each one of us has an opportunity to do something truly great spiritually. So the natural reaction is, I'm going to go first. I want to do the mitzvah. But what we learn from the Malachim is, Rabbi Yisrael, bivakasha, b'chavod. Please, you go ahead. You do the mitzvah first, and then after you, I will do the mitzvah. So that's
a spiritual level.
Yeah. But it's something that we all have to learn from, right? Anyway, so similar is its dictum. So the meaning of this verse being that the whole world bears witness to His perfection, that is, indicates it. I just want to point out it's a very interesting way of saying that the world is perfect. That's not what the pasuk says, and it's not what the Rambam is saying. Because when you think about it, why couldn't the Torah say, instead of saying Melochol haaretz kivodo, say that the world is perfect with God's perfection? Don't say filled with His glory, just say the world is perfect in God's glory. Why not use the word shalem? We have a Hebrew word for perfection or completeness. I talked about this a little bit in my drasha on Shabbos for those who were there. One of the debates that Avraham and Malki had was, according to the Medrash, what the name of Jerusalem should be. So the Medrash tells us that Malki called the city of Jerusalem Shalem, Salem, and Avraham, after the Akedah, was on Mount Moriah overlooking Yerushalayim, he called the name of the city Hashem Yireh, God shall see. So the Medrash records that God made a compromise between Avraham and Malki. He says, not really a compromise, but he said, I have to really use both names. I can't discard Malki name of Shalem, and I can't discard Avraham's name. So I'll create a contraction of those 2 terms, but I'll put Avraham's name first, Yireh, God will see, and Shalem, Yireh Shalem, Yerushalayim. That's how we get the name Yerushalayim. It was originally Shalem, and then it becomes Yerushalayim based on the experience of the Akedah. So we tried to explain on Shabbos that what was really the difference in perspective between Avraham and Melchizedek. And why is it that if Melchizedek was this great monotheist to recognize God, then Judaism is called after Avraham? What happened to Melchizedek's followers? Where did they end up? And we pointed out that Melchizedek's model of divinity was unsustainable in this world, because his view of the world is that it is shalem, that the world is perfect and great. Because if God created it, it has to be shalem. And Avraham's perspective was, especially after the Akedah, after this really experience that from all external appearances looked like a failure, either because Avraham was in the process of engaging in human sacrifice, or because he did not complete what he had set out to do, which is that God told him to do something and then aborted it in the entire command in the middle of the process. But at the end of the day, if Avraham comes down the mountain after the Akedah, not having fulfilled what he had set out to do, then the external appearance of this world is not that the world is perfect, and not that the world is completely reflective of God's glory. The world may be filled with God's glory, but being filled with God's glory is a far cry from being perfect. And that's the reason why I think that whenever we find this idea of the world being a reflection of God's perfection, it doesn't say that the world is perfect like God, because the world is flawed. The world is filled with God's glory, which means that we have to, just like you have something in a container, you sometimes have to work hard to get it out. You have to either pour it out or pull it out or draw it out, depending upon the size of the container and the contents and the difficulty in removing the contents from its container. That is the way that the Torah and the Tanakh, the prophets, describe the world as being a reflection of God's perfection. It in itself, the world is not perfect, but the world can often reflect God's perfection because it is filled with Hashem's perfection.
I thought it was man who wasn't perfect. Hashem is perfect. The world is perfect. That's our flaw. But what the Rav seems to be saying.
No, but the world itself, the circumstances within the world, people die, animals die, things die. There's imperfection around us, not just because of man's imperfection, but there is flaw and defect within anything that is physical by definition of its physicality. God created it not to last. Like they say today, that appliances today are designed for failure, right? Much more so for obsolescence, right? Built-in obsolescence, right? Well, guess what? That may be truer today than it was a generation ago, but the entire world was created with that lack of perfection, with that built-in obsolescence. And so you can't say that the world is a perfect mirror image of Hashem reflecting God's shleimut. But what you can say is that it is filled with God's glory. And at times we are able to see the contents of the world as reflecting God's perfection. And at times we're not, because it is concealed within that container, that exterior of the physical nature of Hashem's world. Okay, similar is the dictum. And the glory of God filled the tabernacle. Uchvod Hashem aleyat hamishkan. That God's glory, like at the very end of the book of Exodus, the glory of God is filling the Mishkan. And let's see. Every mention of filling that you will find referring to God is used in this sense, and not in the sense of there being a body filling a place. And here, of course, we get to the punchline, is that, again, this is a distancing of the corporeality of the word that is implied. Hashem is non-corporeal, and therefore you can't say that God is filling up a place. However, if you wish to consider that the glory of the Lord is the created light that is designated as glory in every passage, and that filled the tabernacle, there is no harm in it. We saw a similar phrase from the Rambam in the last week, where he said that there are times when there are two ways to read a term referring to God, where God is spatially confined. Normally, says the Rambam, the correct reading is that you're reading a metaphorical representation of God. God's never spatially confined. But sometimes when you talk about the glory of God, Kavod Hashem is not Hashem himself. And therefore, Kavod Hashem can be a created substance that God created to represent his his honor. To honor a place, God will sometimes create a certain kind of physical light and deposit it in a place in order to demonstrate to man that this is an place of honor for you to be in. Perfect example is the burning bush, where God manifests himself in a bush. It doesn't mean that God occupied the bush, but that God created a miraculous phenomenon for Moshe to experience the glory of Hashem, to really feel that there was some kind of intellectual closeness with God where he was. Hashem, there are Meforshim who say that is precisely what Hashem created when he allowed a cloud to fill the Mishkan. When it says, Ukvod Hashem aleyat Mishkan, the glory of God was filled the Mishkan, the Rambam says that doesn't literally mean that God was spatially occupying the Mishkan. If, however, you prefer for it to mean that the light that God created and deposited in the Mishkan is what the words Kvod Hashem means, no harm, no foul. Because ultimately we will have to submit at some later time that there was a creation of God called Kvod Hashem that was atop Mount Sinai. Whether or not that is the same created light that was in the Mishkan or not, the Rambam says, I prefer to read it as not a spatial occupation of anything that God created. I mean rather what it means is that the Mishkan represented God's perfection because God was discernible in that place intellectually. But if you want to read it as the same kind of divine light that God created atop Mount Sinai, he also put in the Mishkan, no harm in interpreting that way, even though it may not be the correct interpretation in my opinion. Now what the Rambam is making reference to, and if you turn over your sheet, is later on in the same section 1 in chapter 64, the Rambam actually states that explicitly when he tries to define the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is the four-letter name of Hashem, and in order for us to be able to define it correctly, he also has to get into a discussion of the glory of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Kavod Hashem. And he says as follows, I'm not going to read the entire section. Similarly, he says, the glory of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei is sometimes intended to signify the created light that God causes to descend in a particular place in order to confer honor upon it in a miraculous way. Therefore, for example, and the glory of Hashem abode upon Mount Sinai, and the clouds covered it, and so on. Or, and the glory of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei filled the tabernacle. So you say here, he's saying that the words Kavod Hashem Maleyat HaMishkan is referring to a created light that God caused to descend in a particular place. In our chapter, he says, I only will say that in a later chapter to make it consistent with the Mount Sinai experience. But the really more correct translation of Kavod Hashem for our purposes is that God is detectable in the mind, not that God actually is occupying a physical space. And that's the more correct explanation. So let's remember when we get to chapter 64, and whenever we get to it, we'll also remember to reference back to chapter 19 to make sure that we understand that the Rambam says that the more correct definition of Kavod Hashem is to be filled intellectually with God, or to be a reflection of God's perfection. Okay, this is where we'll hold it for today. Any comments or questions?
I find it hard to believe that the Rambam was really worried about people who would think that the word fill means a corporeal body in reference to God actually coming down and filling a space. I mean, were there actually people at the time who would say or actually believe that when the word fill takes place, that you can actually see a body, a corporeal being that is God filling a particular space?
It's a valid question, and the answer is yes, the Rambam was concerned, because the fact is that there were plenty of corporealists, divine corporealists within Jewish thought. The Gemara itself brings an opinion that says that when it says that God took the Jews out with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, there is an opinion that says that a hand came down from heaven and took the Jews out that way. We have to appreciate that our minds in the 21st century have already been shaped by Maimonidean thinking a long time ago. But with the advent of the Rambam and his philosophical perspective of the absolute non-corporeality of God, that was, for some thinkers, an innovation. Because up until that time, God had always been depicted throughout Tanakh and throughout subsequent writings in anthropomorphic terms. So it is an important exercise. We've done it so many times up until now in the previous sections of the Moreh Nevukhim, so it may seem like beating a dead horse, but the Rambam feels he's got to go through systematically every single verb and every single noun that we find in the Tanakh to make sure that we understand it correctly.
I think the point would be that if you look at the words we looked at in the previous chapter, right? Karov and Nagah, Nigash, right? I mean, those are, you can understand how somebody might think that those words imply corporeality. But Malay is like, what could that, if you were a corporealist, I mean, what could that mean? I think that's what Howard was saying. Like, how would you imagine that?
Well, we imagine that God's Shekhinah fills a place, God's divine presence.
We don't. That's not.
A spirit?
Is that
a spirit? Yeah.
Is that inconsistent with?
It is inconsistent with the Rambam. The Rambam is telling us, do not think in those terms. Do not think that some manifestation of God is actually filling a place.
Not even a spirit.
Not even a spirit. Because that is attributing spatial confinement to Hashem. And the Rambam says you cannot do that if you are truly want to understand Hashem. Cannot do that. Again, even the light that's the fire and the light that's on Har Sinai is not a spirit of God. That's not what Shekhinah means for the Rambam. It's a perception of Hashem in the mind, that God is more present in my own consciousness. That's what it means. So it is a radical approach in that respect.
So when the parents of Shimshon have the experience with the angel and his father realized it was an angel because he went up and we've seen God, now we're going to die. What is this? We've seen God. Why?
We've seen some manifestation of God.
That's seen, right?
Yeah,
Visually.
but an angel is a created being of God, just like the light of God is a created essence. It's not God himself. God creates it in order to show that he wants to create a message for that time and place, having to do with him.
But there is something tangible in an angel.
Apparently so, because Manoach and his wife were not prophets. So this was a created essence. We'll have to see if the Rambam discusses that particular passage.
Yeah, when you see your children or your grandchildren, you say, "I've seen God." It brings to mind God because it's an amazing thing, but you're not really seeing Hashem. The same thing with the angels.
We'll hold it here, everyone. Have a great day.